Morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which part of the world you're in. Uh, this is the Google Hangout with Pankaj Ghemawat on behalf of the Center for Global Enterprises Global Scholars Program. And just to start off with a little bit of a self-introduction, I'm the Global Professor of Management and Strategy at the Stern Business School at NYU, and the Ruby Ralta Professor of Global Strategy at ESA Business School in Barcelona. I'm also a strategy advisor to the Global Scholars Program. So what I thought I would do is tell you briefly why I signed up for this position and what excites me about this initiative. And I'll make my remarks relatively brief because of technical problems. We've gotten off to a slightly late start. So let me talk for a little bit about what's so exciting about the Global Scholars Program in the context of what's going on in the broader globalization space. And then I really would like to try and devote some of the time that we have to the questions that have been coming in focused on this particular Hangout session. So the reason that I thought it was interesting to sign up for this particular initiative has to do with my general sense that people have very, very poor knowledge of the actual facts about globalization. Let me give you an example. When you ask people about whether they believe that the world is completely integrated or flat, typically a majority of people in most of the groups that I've asked about this tend to assert that, in fact, that is the case, that borders no longer matter, that stuff zips back and forth across borders with very little impediment whatsoever. It's interesting to contrast this with data on things that could either happen within national borders or across national borders, and look at the cross-border component as a percentage of the total. So just a little quiz for you to self-administer. Think of all the foreign direct investment that happened in the world last year. What proportion of total investment, domestic and foreign, did it represent? Turns out that the answer is less than 10%. It also turns out that when you ask people about this, when you ask people to guess what that percentage is, you typically get estimates 3, 4, 5 times as high as the actual levels of foreign direct investment. And if you want more details on this, you can go look at a video I did at TED Global a couple of years ago that provides a little bit more data. But what I really want to focus on is not the idea that people's intuitions about how globalized we are tend to be a little bit off base, but why this actually matters. And I think there are a couple of reasons why this matters. First of all, if we think that the world's already completely integrated, there'd be nothing more to be gained from further globalization. So recognizing current levels of integration to be incomplete is crucial in some sense to seeing additional juice to be squeezed out of this lemon, additional potential to improve social welfare, company profitability, etc., by pushing farther ahead with globalization. Second, exaggerations about how globalized the world is also tend to fan the worst fears of anti-globalizers. They feel that there's this gigantic tsunami coming at them that threatens everything that they know and hold dear. And inevitably, that ends up hardening resistance to even very sensible initiatives that would move globalization forward in the right way. To give you a few examples, one example is provided by asking people what percentage of greenhouse gas emissions are accounted for by international air travel. If you thought that that percentage was very high, that might be a case for cutting back on globalization as a way of saving the environment. It's only when you recognize that something like 2.5 to 3% of energy-related greenhouse gas emissions come from international aviation, and that driving, for instance, accounts for 5 to 7 times as much, that you realize that maybe cutting back on globalization to deal with global warming problems is perhaps not the right way of tackling the challenges that we face. So there are a whole bunch of fears of globalization that get amplified by exaggerations about how far globalization has progressed. And that's all at the social level. To talk very briefly about the business level, if you really did believe that the world was completely integrated, you'd probably follow a strategy of what I referred to as bigger and blander, just the pursuit of economies of scale without any attention to the differences between countries that actually seem to create resistance to cross-border flows at national borders. And bigger and blander strategies aren't particularly good for businesses that are actually dealing with environments in which differences are significant. They also feed back into some of the resistance to globalization that I was talking about earlier, in terms of fanning people's fears that globalization, the only thing it has to offer them is this prospect of total cultural homogenization, etc. And obviously, strategies like that do not do much to increase popular support for globalization. So, so far, I've suggested that our factual knowledge of globalization is actually not as good as it could be, and that poor knowledge actually does have some significant consequences, whether one's thinking about social welfare or company profitability. And I think it's interesting to ask oneself, why is this happening? When the data are well known, at least to international economists, one of the few things that international economists agree on is that the world is very, very far from completely globalized. So why, despite that factual knowledge, why isn't that getting transmitted to popular discussions of globalization? Why isn't it having more of an influence on how people think about globalization? I think there are many reasons for this, a lot of which have to do with human biases. So when I see a sign saying world's best pasta, it's unlikely that that pasta has actually been certified to be the best in the world. It's just a way of calling attention to that particular pasta. Similarly, I think exaggerated faith in the power of technology to totally eliminate national borders is another part of the reason for this kind of overestimation. So take, for example, the case of Facebook, which is something that my students like to bring up. Interesting technology that in principle allows you to connect with people halfway around the world just as easily as with people next door. So ask yourself, what percentage of the people on Facebook, what percentage of their friends are actually located in countries other than where those people themselves are based? The answer turns out to be less than 15%, suggesting that yes, there are significant cross-border connections being forged through Facebook, but 15% is way less than the percentage we would expect if we formed friends at random without regard to national origin, languages, etc. So I think if you really focus on technological potential and believe that it trumps culture, politics, everything else, it becomes a little bit easier to sell yourself this vision of a completely integrated world in which we don't need to think about global strategy, for instance, any differently than we think about national strategy, with the caveat that, of course, the world is a larger place, so maybe economies of scale become more important. Those are some biases. The biases are reinforced, and this is really what I want to focus on, because this is where I think the Global Scholars Program affords a unique opportunity. Also has some of the problems that we see in terms of very poor grasp of globalization really has to do with biases in the educational sector that is supposedly responsible for acquainting people with the facts about globalization, encouraging informed discussion of its implications, and so forth. So I think that when you look at the educational sector, and this is a view that I've heard Sam Palmisano, chairman of the Center for Global Enterprise, express several times, the educational sector as currently configured in many countries really does not teach people very much about what is actually involved in trying to manage a business overseas, how you actually run something in a context very different from the one that you're familiar with. And Sam Palmisano's impressions are bolstered by a task force for the AACSB, the leading accreditation body for business schools in the world, that I worked on for 2.5 years on the globalization of business education. Frankly, we found that very little globalization-related content had actually gotten into the curriculum of business schools around the world, even when we focus on the highest ranked, most internationalized, according to other measures, business schools. When you look beyond the business schools at the very apex of the usual rankings, the problem gets even worse because of faculty shortages. So one of the things that the AACSB data seem to indicate, just to take an example, India has something like 3,000 business schools at this point, plus or minus 500. And when we think of the number of people in India with the requisite training and the background in international business to teach globalization, it strikes me that that's even more of an ineluctable constraint than what one sees in the US, where there is a little bit more of an abundance of talent in this area, just because business education is a better developed sector in the United States. So the Global Scholars Program, in my view, and as I said, I'm not an authorized spokesman, I'm just a strategic advisor, but the reason I find it interesting to be associated with the Global Scholars Program is that it responds to this void in the marketplace where business schools, other educational institutions really aren't pushing very hard on developing better understanding across borders, including better understanding of cross-border phenomena. And just to be specific about some of the specific aspects of the Global Scholars Program that I found very attractive, let me just contrast it very briefly with a MOOC, a massive open online course on globalization that I'm currently offering on the Coursera platform. The MOOC has been a fascinating learning experience, but really doesn't involve much or permit much interactivity across the participants. It's very much a one-to-many model without much of an opportunity beyond discussion boards, which quickly get unmanageable when you have several thousand students participating. Beyond that, there's very little opportunity for peer-to-peer learning. There's very little opportunity for people within a particular region who might have more things of interest in common to connect with each other, as opposed to trying to connect with everybody on this one-size-fits-all platform. So I think that the attractive aspect of the Global Scholars Program is that it's looking at ways of moving beyond this one-to-many model of the development and dissemination of content to trying to create, especially with its two-tier structure involving both faculty and students at business institutions around the world, to try and get them engaged in the business of keeping the material evergreen, continuing to push the discussion forward, rather than relying on some centralized repository of knowledge and wisdom about globalization to influence and even dominate the conversation. And while we're still in the early stages of trying to figure out exactly what the configuration is going to be like, what the platform will be, one of the things that gives me confidence is that when I look at the people behind the Center for Global Enterprise, if anybody can figure out what kinds of technology might be best suited to meeting the clear needs out there, it's probably this group of people. So the objective here is to really do something more than the traditional one-to-many model, really to try and create a global community. And while that's talked about in many contexts, it's worth remembering that globalization is the topical area in which there are arguably the biggest benefits to actually creating a global community, to actually having people communicate across national borders. And that's why, for me, this is a very, very exciting initiative in terms of what it's trying to do that's different from what actors in the space are currently themselves attempting. So those were my brief introductory remarks, trying to sort of explain why, in my view, the Global Scholars Program really looks like it could mark a change in terms of how we think about talking about globalization, teaching globalization, and so forth. And now, probably worth turning to some of the questions that we've had come in response to this invitation to, raise issues that we could productively discuss during this hangout. So, just to start with the first question that came in. First question was from Yasmin Zarhan, asking, in this age of globalization, what are the qualities of effective talent and what are the opportunities that Moroccan young people in particular could seek in order to improve themselves outside their home country? I think that what I've been talking about actually sort of ties in very, very directly with this question. The idea is that in an age where the world, while not completely globalized, is getting more connected across borders, and with a context in which established educational institutions really aren't meeting the challenge, what talent needs to become a bit more globally employable, a bit more globally mobile, or at least more globally informed, is first of all some acquaintance with the facts of globalization, and we hope to be providing some materials along those lines, but also, as much as the factual knowledge, interchange and experience dealing with people from other nationalities is one of the things that most helps broaden people's outlooks. And that's why I'm so excited about this notion of moving beyond one to many to something that actually does involve more interaction amongst peers, something that does involve more forging of connections directly across borders, rather than routing everything through a centralized node, as it were. So that was one of the questions that came in. To take another one, how are companies in developing countries affected by today's highly competitive market and global companies? What should they do in order to succeed? Again, first of all, I think just the very premise of this question is a useful reminder that what we're talking about is probably not a world in which there are a handful of giant global corporations that dominate all lines of activity. What we're probably talking about is a mixed model in which there are likely to be some large global corporations, and then depending on the line of business, there are likely to be local, regional, and other players. Based on the research that I personally have been doing in China and other places, it does seem that sectoral characteristics matter a great deal. Obviously, if you're in the airframe business, if you make airplanes, you probably need your market to be global to amortize the fixed costs of developing a plane. In contrast, if you're working in real estate or some other sectors, in many instances, although there are exceptions to this, there are certainly real estate companies that look internationally, things are likely to be more localized. So a very simple marker I found in some research I did with my co-author, Tom Hout in China, is that in general, when you look at interactions between multinationals and local players, multinationals have tended to do well, relatively well, within those sectors in China in which R&D intensities and advertising intensities are relatively high, which are, of course, the classical explanations as to why multinationals exist. And in other sectors with medium or low levels of advertising and R&D intensity, you actually see market share leads being held by Chinese competitors rather than by Western or Japanese competitors. Obviously, this picture is evolving as Chinese companies upgrade. So when we start thinking about companies like, say, Huawei in IP equipment, they've clearly managed to do very well in highly R&D intensive sectors. So the broader point I'd leave you with is not a specific sense of where multinationals are going to do well and where local companies are going to do well, but a reminder that what's likely to result is a mixed model in which there are ample opportunities for multinationals to learn from local players and for local players to learn from multinationals. So that was in response to Bess Jones' question. Think turning to Mirjana Sedini, she would like to discuss about the challenge of education and educators in transition economies whose resources are not up to the level of their country's development, but whose expectations are high. Is that too much to aim and expect? Well, I think that that's precisely one of the areas in which we're hoping that the Global Scholars Program can be helpful. I referred to India earlier, but I could have equally well been talking about what more traditionally are considered transition economies, because when you look at these economies, clearly the challenge of business knowledge in general and more knowledge about globalization in particular is a very important one. But when you think of the supply side constraints, how long it takes to develop the educational institutions, the professorial infrastructure, etc., necessary to actually provide that kind of training, it becomes clear that we need to think of supplementing our traditional face-to-face classroom model with more technology-based platforms of the sort that the Global Scholars Program is contemplating. And again, the face-to-face has some of its distinct attractions. Technology platforms have some of their distinctive attractions. But I would argue that in much of the world, even more so than in the United States and other advanced economies, the solution is probably likely to involve more of technology and a bit less of face-to-face as probably the most expedient way of overcoming some of these constraints that these economies are stuck with as a result of their legacies. So that would be my perspective on the educational mix in transitional economies, probably being more influenced by the kinds of models we're talking about here, rather than just the traditional models of first we'll take 20 years to train the professors, and then we'll have the professors train the students. That's a very, very long path to getting to where we need to get to. Another question has to do with globalization. This is from Ankit. With globalization, how can nonprofit organizations reap more benefits in terms of resources, finance, and technology during the present era? So to respond to that, I think one of the things I've been struck by in the limited amount of work I've done with nonprofits is how, at least at the level of understanding and thinking about strategy, many, not all, but many of the issues that nonprofits face would benefit from some of the same kinds of discussions that we use to try and influence how our students who are going out into the for-profit world should be thinking about globalization. Let me give you a couple of specific examples. In Barcelona, I worked briefly with a nonprofit called World Reader, which tries to bring ebooks to African countries. And it's been an interesting experience as they've realized that many of the lessons from business strategy in the for-profit sector apply to their situation as well. So as they were thinking about which countries to target, for instance, it became clear that rather than pursuing a scattershot approach, what they needed to do was go in, pick a limited number of geographies, and understand those in great depth as a way of trying to identify what the key constraints in terms of infrastructure, political support, resources, etc., they were going to face, rather than simply assuming that the issues were going to be similar no matter which country they actually went into. So while the objectives are obviously different in the nonprofit sector, and while the funding mechanisms differ as well, clear thinking about where you're operating, why you're operating there, and what you're trying to get done seems to be just as essential in the nonprofit sector as it is in the for-profit sector. Let's see, looking around, another question, this was from Mechiaka Fatima Zara wanting to know, since our world is increasingly interconnected by many actors worldwide, especially the financial sector, I'd like to know what is the real impact of financial flows on sustainable development. I think that's a great question, because I think that there's been, especially in the wake of the financial crisis, a lot of discussion of what role financial flows can play in improving or outcomes or degrading them. I think it's interesting that even the IMF, which is certainly usually not the most avant-garde institution in this regard, has come around to the conclusion that short-run financial flows are things that we probably do need to pay some attention to. They were clearly overdone in some respects before the financial crisis. In contrast, all the evidence that I've seen on anything other than very short-run hot money flows suggests that foreign direct investment, portfolio equity investment, long-term debt are all things that sort of really help us alleviate some of the local resource constraints that face countries that are all trying to improve their standards of living. And so with the caveat around very, very short-run financial flows, I would argue that financial flows, cross-border financial flows in general, are very beneficial to ensuring that financial constraints don't get in the way of the upgrading process that economies, particularly poorer economies, are embarked on. So that was Mechiaka's question. Question from Modu Diop. Nowadays, how can we use technology in our strategies, and how can management be used to combine the development of talent and the emerging developments in technology like cloud and so forth? Well, I mean, I think that when we look at what the discourse in business has been about in the last 10, 20 years, clearly there's a way in which technology has captured the spirit and the imagination of the age that certainly wasn't the case when I was taking business school courses back in the late 70s, early 1980s. So clearly the role of technology looking forward does seem like it's significantly more marked than it was, say, back in the 1980s or 1990s. I think one instance of course, the power of technology is the fact that despite some hiccups early on in this process, we're actually having this conversation across national borders in a way that's far more convenient for me than if I had to visit all of you in each of the countries in which you're located. So technology clearly facilitates communication, which I think is one of the big differences that it makes to global strategies. We just have way more information flows now available thanks to technology across different parts of a global corporation, or across companies, separate companies in different countries than we used to, all of which aids the diffusion of knowledge, prevents us from all having to reinvent the wheel each time over and over again. Second, I think that, adverting to one of the earlier questions, I do think that while technology is important across the board, particularly when we start thinking about some of the constraints facing emerging or transition economies, technology is going to be a particularly important lever for trying to skip several steps in the development process, for trying to leapfrog, as it were, old technologies and catch up much more quickly with advanced economies. So while we sometimes think of advanced economies as being at the forefront of technology development, it's worth remembering that adaptation of those technologies, broader use of those technologies, is actually a very, very powerful lever for economic development in general. So the traditional view of the world, in which technology was something that rich countries tended to work on and poor countries tended to ignore as they went about their business, is one that I think has changed greatly when we start to see what's happening in a number of different economies. in India, for instance, I spent more than a dozen years working as an advisor to one of the largest Indian IT companies, information technology companies, and it really is quite striking to realize not just the tangible contributions that the Indian IT sector has made to India's development and to the rest of the world, but also the psychological impact of realizing that, India too can excel at certain kinds of technologies it has had on general levels of self-confidence, a general conviction that, we're not condemned to forever be behind. We can, in fact, move forward. And I think time for one more question. So I think this is a question about, again, more about the Global Scholars Program. So let me sort of simply reiterate what I was talking about earlier. The idea with the Global Scholars Program, and the model is still nascent and something that's being worked on, but the idea very simply is to use technology as a way of improving our level of understanding of not just globalization, but of each other in a way that should bring both social and private benefits. And the only way in which this is going to happen, if you really do believe that the world is a wide place with lots of differences, is if we do manage to create a network in which people from all around the world are contributing to the materials that we have, the materials that we disseminate, as a way of taking more than a perspective centered on a particular country as being one that automatically applies to all the other countries in the world. So the hope really is that this is going to grow up. Obviously, it'll start off with some seeding of material centrally, etc. But the longer run vision here is very much one of distributed learning rather than one-to-many learning as a way of pushing forward in this endeavor that is important at multiple different levels, at many different levels. It's important at the global level because one of the problems that we face today is a lack of understanding and a lack of trust across national borders. It's certainly important at the company level as companies continue, especially after the crisis, to struggle with the imperatives of penetrating foreign markets while dealing with the differences that they present. And it's helpful, presumably, at a personal level. I think that, if you follow some of the materials and some of the discussions we're planning to have, I certainly find this with my students in a face-to-face setting, helps you think a little bit differently about what a global career actually entails and what kinds of qualifications might best equip you to succeed in a world whose interconnectivity is certainly not perfect, but whose interconnectivity is increasing, opening up new kinds of opportunities, as well as presenting new kinds of challenges. So let me see if there's anything else that's come in. And I think those were the questions that we received for this Hangout. And so to summarize, this is simply this little Hangout was simply a way of sharing with you, some of you, what the plans are for this very exciting new venture. But those plans are only going to be realized if you actually contribute to helping make them a reality. Thank you very much.